Colin, welcome to the show. You are an immensely popular figure in the internet space. I've been doing my research on you, and there's only positive things that people have to say about you. They attribute the whole revival of jazz in Goa to you and your organization. And I know that you started off your career in Mumbai. So while right now we have these nightclubs playing techno and electronic music, at that time, during your time, there were these smoky, jazzy nightclubs where you were a resident bass player and you worked with multiple bands and you learned on the go. From what I know, this inspired you to craft your own path and you moved back to Goa and you started your own scene there and you started welcoming others into your space after building a studio in Goa. And this led to the growth of Jazz Goa. Now, how I came across your music, it's I was looking for Creative Commons content which I could put on my radio, and then I come across this album called Konkani Jazz, and it had the most amazing rendition of Konkani Jazz that I've ever seen, and I don't think there is any other album out there which has mixed Konkani and jazz together and it's done such a perfect job as well. So I dug deeper, and that's how I came across the Jazz Goa Bandcamp catalog. And here we are now, and here I am talking to you right now. I want people to know more about you and your work and your organization's work. So, here are a set of questions that I wanted to get through with you. And again, welcome to the Jazz Goa show on the Brain Dance Radio.
Thank you, Firoz. Thank you for having me on your show.
So, Colin, like I was saying, I did my research on you. And a lot of interesting things came up. So, now one thing that you had mentioned, I think, in an interview with Citizen Reporter Goa was that you came from a family background where there were no musicians. None of your ancestors were musicians, and no one in your immediate family were musicians. But you had that passion for music and especially for jazz. And that's how you started off. Now, could you tell me as to what inspired you to start off with music and jazz in particular, especially when you were in an environment where you did not have music around you?
My earliest memories of music would be live music events that my parents took me to as a child. I vividly remembered there was some kind of magic taking place on stage. This probably stayed in my subconscious and came into play when I finally decided to be a musician. So even if my family didn't have musicians, it was a family outing that started it all. Like most youngsters, I began playing music hoping to be a rock star. Jazz came into play much later, and when it did come, it came with a bang. It was love at first sound. I was hooked for life.
Considering the amount of skill that's required to play great improvisational pieces in jazz, how many hours did you practice in a day? So, are there periods where you take a break, or have you been consistently going at it? And if consistently, on an average, how many hours were you spending? And keeping apart the amount of time that you were putting in for learning the instruments, how much of your time went into finding artists, arranging spaces, finding venues? And you are now at this point committed to 4 different bands. So, how do you juggle all of these? Do you spend your whole day in the music space itself?
I never really had a regular practice regime. When I decided to play professionally, I realized I would need to know more about what I would be spending the rest of my life with. I taught myself to read music from some great books and used my reading skills as a tool to increase my musical vocabulary. I still enjoy playing it by ear. At any given point in my career, I was always a member of more than 4 bands. I think getting cliquish and hanging on to just one circle of musicians can come in the way of widening your musical horizons.
You were born and brought up in Mumbai. You were playing in Mumbai, and then one day I think you found a better scope for your music and for your work in Goa and a better environment as well. And you moved to Goa. So you moved to Goa and then you put up your very own studio. How was that transition for you to move from the place where your family was, to move from the place where you're born and brought up to a completely new space, and you have to start everything from scratch? So how did you go about building your studio there in during such a time? Did you have people around to help you? Did you yourself have the expertise to develop a studio? And was it difficult to run and operate a studio at that time, considering the expenses that it might have involved?
Like most Mumbaikars, moving out of Mumbai was a very difficult decision to make. I finally moved to Goa in the year 2008 with just one regret. I wish I had moved earlier. I have lived in many countries around the world, and I think there's no place like Goa. It's not just the beautiful surroundings and beaches, it's the warmth of the people who live here and their peaceful, happy, relaxed lifestyle. Setting up a studio and working with musicians here was a piece of cake simply because people have all the time in the world here. Unlike Mumbai, where I have no time is a standard reply. Goa is also a second home to musicians from around the world. It's an inspiring place for any creative artist. And I always say, why travel out into the world when the whole world travels to me in Goa?
So you're now in Goa. How did you find artists in Goa who could work with you and collaborate with you? So how do you usually find young talent in Goa? Do these people come and inquire about you, or do you go out there, go for different live gigs and scout and find, hey, this is good talent right here. I want him to work with me in my studio. Is that how it works?
After over 12 years, Jazz Goa has established itself as an entity not just in Goa and across India, but around the world, thanks to the internet. Same way that you found me. Most locals know about Jazz Goa and they always approach me when they have a song they would like to record. Jazz Goa studio is available to them free of cost. I have been collaborating with musicians from all over the world for a long time now. You'll hear some of the amazing results on the Jazz Goa app. It can be downloaded for free at jazzgoa.com.
Now there's a whole pandemic happening here, and the live music scene has come down a lot because of such circumstances. And you can noticeably see there's a slow transition of people playing music live but sharing it with the audience in a virtual space or online or by broadcasting it. So, what do you think will happen to live music considering what's happening around you right now? Do you think we will go back to the olden days where people would gather together for live music performance, or do you think we're going to completely transition into a digital concert space?
During this pandemic, most musicians took to digital platforms. You can't keep a musician down for too long. One thing I'm quite sure about, these online gigs are a temporary solution. Nothing can replace the magic of human interaction. Live music will soon return to its rightful place on a concert stage.
While going through the Jazz Goa catalog, I was very impressed with the wide range of genres that were there within the catalog itself. So, not only were you covering jazz and local interpretations of jazz, you also had fusion, reggae, and blues. Well, now, what particularly struck me was that reggae is quite far away from the conventional and traditional sense of jazz, but it fit in very nicely with the Jazz Goa and what it had to sell. So, how did that come into the picture? Did you go out and find people who were playing reggae music in Goa, or were the reggae artists who heard about your work and they came to you and said, hey, we think we'll fit in well into what you are conveying to your audience over here? Is that how the relationship started, or did you yourself have a soft spot for reggae music?
Jazz is the most open, alive, and evolving form of music. It embraces all other forms of music. You name the genre and you can find a jazz attached to it. Jazz rock, pop jazz, Latin jazz, country jazz, jazz blues, you name it, jazz. It's all out there.
And on those lines, apart from the copious amount of attention that you give to jazz, are there other genres of music that really interest you and excite you?
The more forms of music I listen to, the more I widen my jazz horizons. When it came to music, I always wanted it all.
I think when the movie La La Land came out, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's quite a hit with the mainstream movie audience. There's this one part, and it's a movie on jazz and the beauty of jazz. And this is one part in the movie where they talk about how it mainly came, jazz was born during a period where African Americans couldn't freely communicate with each other and, express their anguish, their emotions clearly to each other. And jazz was a great instrument for them to do that. And during these jazz jams and performances that were happening, these players would play their music in such a way that they were actually, through their music, talking to the person right next to them, to the band member right next to them. How much of this is true? Like, I mean, do you actually feel like you're having a conversation with another member in your band when you're getting into your improvisational piece?
Yes, a jazz musician does communicate through his instrument or voice, not just with the fellow musicians on stage, but across the stage with the audience. I've always had this contention that if jazz is improvised music, it didn't originate in America. Indian classical music is all about improvisation. Improvised music always existed in the world. It's just that America coined a new name for it called jazz.
From my perspective, jazz has been spreading in the widest of areas, and there are a lot of young musicians who are pushing the jazz movement in all directions. So, a couple of my favorite new age jazz musicians would be Sarthi Korwar and Mark Juliana. For you, who's been in the jazz scene for a really long time now, you understand the direction in which jazz is spreading. Is there any fresh and young talent that you would recommend to people to take a listen to? And if not new age musicians, is there any older artist or a classic jazz musician whom you would like the younger generation to pay attention to?
Today, jazz has grown into a global entity. It's no longer your music or my music, it's our music. And it's not just about improvisation, it's a meeting of minds and cultures. To keep one foot in the past and plunge the other into the future. I listen to the legends Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald. At the same time, I listen to the innovators who push back the boundaries of jazz. Weather Report, Yellow Jackets, and many more.
As I mentioned before, you are a prominent face in the jazz scene in India and the face of Goan jazz. And it's a fact that the United Nations approached you for conducting a jazz festival and helping them organize a jazz festival in Goa. Now, when it comes to these jazz festivals, is you participated in several internationally and also performed in them. Would you, for someone who's new to jazz, would you recommend any specific jazz festival that they can attend to get a taste of what jazz has to offer?
The Jazz Yatra in Mumbai, launched in 1978, used to be the longest standing jazz festival in the world. It featured legends from all over the world. The festival came to an end after a record breaking run. Internationally, the North Sea Jazz Festival, the Cocteau Jazz Festival, the Montreux Jazz Festival are just some of the festivals still holding the fort.
Considering the level that Jazz Goa has reached right now, with a huge fan following both within India and internationally, what plans do you have for yourself and for your organization now?
I live in Goa, remember? So no big master plan in the pipeline. Jazz Goa will just go with the flow.
And finally, as someone who's been in jazz for a really long time, what advice do you have to give to people who would like to step into the world of jazz as a musician or as an audience, and especially for the younger generation that's out there right now?
There are 3 stages to every musician's career: imitation, assimilation, and innovation. My advice to youngsters is to go through all 3, finally innovating and creating an identity for yourself in the world of music.